Hello and welcome to our three-part discussion on artificial intelligence, where we will explore some of the issues that will affect or probably transform the way we think about the role of the individual executive or corporate leader, the impact on the way companies may operate, and how society itself will change. I'm Paul Lewis, Editorial Director of Headspring, and to discuss these big questions, I'm joined by Mark Esposito, a leading thinker, writer, and teacher on artificial intelligence, and whom I'm very proud to say is also one of Headspring's faculty members. So Mark, welcome. And let me start by asking you where we are currently. Where do we stand with innovation, data, digitalization, and artificial intelligence developments? What is coming down the line? What are the biggest changes we're likely to see first?
Great. Thanks for having me, Paul, and good to have this conversation with you today. I think we have to start from the obvious. COVID has been, as we know, a catalyst, an accelerant, an echo chamber. Maybe it's important to quantify how much we really have digitally transformed. We roughly estimate that we are 6 to 7 years ahead of time when we were back in 2019 in terms of the digital transformation efforts. That doesn't mean we are digitally transformed, and there's a cultural component about transformation that sometimes is underrated. We have to consider that organizations only change once they're culturally aligned, but from a technology perspective, we are definitely ahead. The other things that really has changed, which is so like, let's call it silver lining for the lack of a better expression. We have changed the nature of the internet through COVID. We now are expanding the internet by roughly 30 to 35% from what the internet used to be before COVID. So what COVID has done is really have expanded the internet to the next generation. This is why we start hearing things like Web 1, Web 2, and now Web 3. Which are really our way of defining where the internet is really going, and a much more, I would say, comprehensive way of integrating the internet into our life. So that's to give you a bit of a sense of at the very macro level on the onset of COVID. What really has then happened in more practical terms for organizations is that companies have started to really ask the question, where can we innovate through technology? Where do we have existing solutions where we don't have necessarily to invest a large amount of capital to actually integrate? Where is the open innovation? Where are the, let's say, shortcuts to start digitizing? And we have seen a race towards that. Just a few examples. Cashiers that are now entirely automated, we already saw them, for example, in the UK, in Tesco, or in other, Sainsbury, for example. Now we have accelerated that even more. Now we have even more automatic cashier than before. Cashless payments were already before 2019, but now, because at the very beginning we wanted to avoid contact of money, we have seen cashless payments propelling and mushrooming all over. And from the Google Pay to the Apple Pay to different form of payments, we see this now as a much more prominent forms of payments, so digital payments altogether. And I think finally, as this introductory conversation on where the trends are going, if financial technology, what we call in lay terms fintech, was already almost like challenging the big houses. Today, financial technology is not only challenging the big houses, but it has taken a dimension on its own. Today, fintech or techfin is almost like a standalone. We have a lot of different organizations that are operating in the access to capital to people that are underbanked by traditional financial players, namely the banks. And we have seen a rise of people that are creating credit history simply because they're using non-banking systems. We see this in Latin America, we see this in the African continent, we saw this in Europe. We have been witnessing this in Asia for quite some time. So the world has become much more convergent in terms of the financial inclusion that was not as prominent as it was prior to COVID. So I would say these are some of the trends that I start noticing the most. There's one more that I think is worth for us to throw out there, and maybe we can elaborate more, which is, of course, this entire idea about the metaverse. That is a bit of a buzzword. It's less than a buzzword than other buzzwords, so to say, because of the people behind the metaverse. So the amount of investment currently flowing into this are quite significant. And clearly the composition of the metaverse the constituents of the metaverse, and what it will mean for all of us from a technical perspective, but more importantly, from a societal perspective, is really where we have to have a deeper conversation and engagement on this.
Thank you very much. Is there a tipping point where the sort of the balance of power changes? So all those things you've mentioned in terms of, payments, in terms of retailing, it seems that there are, what was once marginal now is sort of a competing way of doing things. But I'm just wondering when it becomes the dominant way, where it becomes very difficult to use cash, for example, where people will be, say, on the metaverse, and that's where they lead their lives, where, in terms of fintech, the system of banking and financial services fundamentally transformed in the old way is sort of pushed to the margins or excluded. Are we close to a tipping point in any of these sectors in any ways, or are these two things going to just, the two ways of doing transactions, will they sort of coexist?
Yeah, Paul, thanks for this. So I would say what matters for us is to introduce the idea that we have severe economic asymmetries around the world. What happens in Brazil or in Colombia is not the same that happens in London or in Brussels, right? So we have very different behavior, different uses. So I don't see convergence to the point in which the tipping point will become a global blanket. I see pockets of application that are becoming very significant, from Jakarta in Indonesia to Seoul in South Korea, to some cities in China, to maybe selective regions in India. I think we see application of technology at a deeper level in specific regions, but we don't see this yet at the level of convergence. Fundamentally, because what COVID has done is created even more digital divide, Paul. So when we have digital divides, we have regions that are completely excluded from this opportunity. So we can still say cash is still king in this case, but we also will see other regions that will over time abandon cash. I'm going to give you an example. Algeria in North Africa is a country where MasterCard is struggling to turn into digital payments. But on the other hand, if you're looking at, for example, Sweden, it's hard to pay in cash in Sweden because most of the coffee shop will ask you card only. But let's go to China. In China, since roughly 15 years, if you take a taxi ride and you don't pay with a WeChat app, it's kind of hard to get an exchange back from the taxi driver. They don't carry cash. So I would say we have multiple story, multiple narrative that do not necessarily show I would say, unifying tipping point, but they show that organically speaking, in multiple parts of the world, this transformation is really happening. Time, labor cost, policy will probably determine how quickly we'll see this applied on a more universal level. But clearly the changes from before are happening, not wholly concentrated in the formal capital of finance. No surprise that in London, we could pay cashless since years. The interesting story is it happens maybe in Quito, Ecuador now. Maybe it happens in Bogota. So it's really the application going to regions that were not necessarily part of the usual suspects back in the days.
Very, very interesting. So it's not necessarily levels of traditional sort of economic development, but it could be the political context and the willingness of people to sort of adopt technology and so on. But it's interesting because it sounds like it's a sort of a medium-term view. It's very hard to look beyond that. But we do have this idea of sort of leapfrogging technologies, don't we, where those who are behind suddenly see the benefit of adopting. We see this in telecommunications and banking to some extent. I'm just wondering whether or not it's going to be a very messy process, but ultimately, for all sorts of reasons, the choice may not be there for very long. Or are you saying, look, the choice will always be there because ultimately people want it?
That's a good point, Paul. I think governance and regulation will play a major role. If you're looking, for example, at the entire buzz we had on crypto, you go to Latin America, in most countries, crypto are still considered illegal. So unlikely we'll see people saving on cryptos in the same way as we see them when we are in Europe. On the other hand, going back to the conversation of leapfrogging, the moment that a change of government, look at El Salvador, they suddenly pegged their currency to Bitcoin. A change of government suddenly leapfrogs directly into the application of a cryptocurrency as a national currency for a country. The cycles of transformation are much shorter than before. So I would say clearly we have to think about how quickly things could change very quickly. Will we still have options and choices? I mean, it goes back to, if you remember, the time where we were thinking that books would disappear because we now had Kindles. They haven't. There's still people that will prefer a physical book over like an electronic book. It doesn't make it less or more valuable. It just makes a choice. So I think we will always have a choice in that sense, Paul. In terms of money, though, what is important to say is that only 10% of the global wealth is actually in cash. Already 90% is actually transacted on digital formats. Whether that will become smaller, I would imagine it's likely to happen, but I don't think it will completely disappear. And I hope it won't, because you see, physical cash, if we talk about money, it still represents a beacon of trust that people have in exchanging through whatever they are trying to buy or sell. And also teaching money to kids is much more effective with cash rather than a digital card, right? Because you really understand the idea of fungibility. So I'm hoping that they will always have the option, but clearly less now than the same conversation we could have had 20 years ago.
Is it a question that new innovations and technologies, they don't necessarily eliminate the previous way of doing things, but what they do is that it forces to revert back to its sort of original or its singular value?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, TV didn't wipe out the radio, and
That's right.
videos, and the internet doesn't wipe out TV. So, but one uses it as an original thing, which is maybe it's an area for sort of community, or when you're doing something else. Is that what we're looking at, or is it just a matter of time before? I mean, what's cash? What does cash provide? Cash provides anonymity.
Yeah.
But maybe that's irrelevant where there's facial recognition and there's other ways of tracking what people buy and consume.
I think, Paul, it's interesting. I have an example from a different industry that helps me to understand what's happening. So when I go to London, I can choose to have an Uber, or I can go into a black cab. The black cabs did not disappear because Uber came to town. We expanded the market rather than thinking that the market was replaceable or displaceable. So I think the same happens for most of this technology. They don't necessarily directly disrupt. They disrupt at first, but over time, we expand the market. And they sometimes play, I would say, a beneficial role. Example, last time I was in London in January, I went on to black cab. Now I can pay cashless. I don't have to worry about having cash. So having an entirely fleet of cars that we pay on credit card did not necessarily eradicate the black cab. It just made them more digital. So I think the idea is finding this gray area where there is some form of contamination in which innovation and disruption do not necessarily directly, allow me the term, kill the competition or the incumbency. They expand it. I think the same will happen in a number of different fields. Probably with cash and money, it's slightly different because nonetheless, the evolution of cash towards digital started from banks already before the fintech revolutions. It was banks that started the online banking. It was banks that started to think, why would I need to have a branch when I can merely shift the operating cost to consumers? So I still think there will be cash, but I think fundamentally what we're doing is we're adding option rather than thinking that there is a trade-off in which either or. And I think this is the fascination about technology. At first, it looks to be much more aggressive on the incumbency. Over time, we realize that they're simply expanding the narrative into something else. We become more sophisticated because we have more choices.
That's very reassuring for some people. Just quickly, you've talked about the different areas of change. Are there certain sectors in your mind that you think are ahead of the game here? We've mentioned sort of finance, fintech, and so on. Are there other sectors where you see very, very big change on the horizon? And I guess, how does the digitalization interact with other scientific breakthroughs, neuroscience, medicine, genetics, in a way that might sort of catapult our progress far further than we are even anticipating with the technology of today?
pose a fascinating question. I think, financial players, insurance companies, they have always been very prone on the transformation because they are always exposed to the cutting edge technology. So clearly, financial companies today, they are integrating some of this technology from blockchain to digital twins. They're playing with the idea of crypto. They're thinking about tokens. They are flirting with NFTs. So they are clearly in a position where they can be more active participants to the story. What I think is interesting is whether we are introducing more the behavioral side or the more human-centric side to technology. And I think this is happening in healthcare, where, for example, precision medicine in some part of Europe are making phenomenal progress, where we are now doing surgeries to people with precision techniques. They're improving significantly quality of life and recovery time and healing. So I think there are elements in which we are humanizing technology. I think there is a way for me to say that we spent a significant amount of the 90s until now to augment technology for the sake of technology. I think what COVID really gave us as a silver lining is maybe we can use technology to augment humans. And I think that will probably be a fundamental new chapter of what I call the techno-optimism, on where we see technology as a proxy for enhancement society, rather than technology just merely economic measure of efficiency.
Thank you very much, Mark. Well, I'd like to talk about those in another session. This gives us a very useful insight to where we stand now. And I look forward to talking again in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thanks.